For over 2,000 years, one name has been treated as a kind of shorthand for beauty itself. Poets compared women to her. Painters spent entire careers imagining her face. Hollywood cast some of the most celebrated actresses in history to play her. Tonight, we're going to gently set that image aside and look instead at what history actually tells us about Cleopatra, because the real story turns out to be far more interesting than the legend and far more about her mind than her face. Cleopatra VII was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries by the time she came into the world. It's worth pausing on that, because it surprises a lot of people. Cleopatra wasn't ethnically Egyptian at all. Her family descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's own generals, who claimed Egypt for himself after Alexander's death. For generations, the Ptolemies kept largely to themselves, marrying within their own family, speaking Greek, and remaining culturally distant from the land they ruled. Cleopatra, remarkably, was the very first member of her dynasty to actually learn the Egyptian language. She grew up in Alexandria, at that time one of the great intellectual centers of the entire ancient world, home to the famous Library of Alexandria and the Mausoleum, a kind of ancient research academy. Her education was extraordinary for anyone of her era, let alone a woman. She studied philosophy, science, and rhetoric, and by most historical accounts, she became fluent in numerous languages: Egyptian, Greek, Latin, and reportedly several others used across the region she governed. This mattered enormously. It meant Cleopatra could speak directly with foreign ambassadors, religious leaders, and her own subjects, without needing a translator standing between her and the people she needed to influence. In a world of careful diplomacy, that kind of direct, personal connection was an enormous political advantage. Now, let's gently address the question this video is actually built around. Was Cleopatra beautiful? And if you're expecting a simple yes or no, the honest answer is that historians genuinely don't agree, and the evidence itself is frustratingly thin. Here's the complication. We have no artwork or writing about Cleopatra created during her actual lifetime by someone who definitely saw her in person and left behind a clear physical description. What we do have are a small number of surviving coins minted during her reign, a handful of statues that may or may not accurately depict her, and later written accounts from Roman historians who were born after she died. Let's start with the coins, since they're actually our most reliable evidence. Surviving coins from Cleopatra's reign show her with a strong, sharply hooked nose, a jutting chin, and fairly angular, severe features nothing close to the soft, classically idealized beauty we associate with ancient sculpture. When a coin bearing her image went on public display at a university in England some years ago, newspapers around the world treated it as a shocking revelation, describing her as plain, even unflattering. But here's the thing: historians want you to understand those coin portraits likely weren't inaccurate at all. Royal coinage across the ancient Mediterranean world tended to emphasize strong, individually recognizable features rather than soft, idealized beauty, especially for rulers who wanted to project authority and legitimate lineage rather than delicate charm. In other words, Cleopatra may have deliberately chosen to be depicted this way, precisely because it made her look like a serious, powerful monarch, closely resembling the male rulers who came before her in her family line, rather than a decorative queen consort. The handful of surviving statues tell a similarly mixed story. The most famous, known as the Berlin Cleopatra, shows a woman with a prominent nose and composed, dignified features, striking, certainly, but not necessarily what most people today would call classic beauty. Other fragments and carvings vary wildly, some showing softer, more conventionally feminine features, others emphasizing the same strong, angular look found on her coins. Without a single confirmed, universally agreed upon portrait, historians simply can't reconstruct her exact appearance with any real confidence. So where did the legend of overwhelming physical beauty actually come from? This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because much of it traces back to something closer to political propaganda than historical fact. After Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, her old rival Octavian became the first Roman emperor, taking the name Augustus. Octavian had spent years locked in a bitter power struggle with Mark Antony, Cleopatra's final partner and ally. To justify that conflict to the Roman public, Octavian needed a story that made Antony look less like a Roman general making his own political calculations, and more like a man who had been dangerously seduced and manipulated by a foreign queen. Painting Cleopatra as an irresistible, almost supernatural temptress served that purpose perfectly. It let Rome frame the entire conflict not as one Roman fighting another, but as Rome defending itself against a dangerous foreign influence. It's a strategy historians have seen repeated throughout history, powerful women in politics being reduced to their supposed sexual influence rather than being credited with genuine political skill. From there, the legend simply kept growing, generation after generation. Roman writers writing decades and even centuries after her death leaned into the seductress narrative. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing roughly 2 centuries after Cleopatra's reign, described her as strikingly beautiful, but he was born long after she died, repeating a legend rather than describing anything he'd witnessed himself. Interestingly, the Greek writer Plutarch, writing closer to her actual lifetime, offered a very different take, suggesting her physical beauty wasn't especially remarkable at all, but that her presence, her conversation, and her voice were genuinely captivating in a way that went far beyond appearance. Centuries later, medieval poets and writers embellished the legend even further, transforming her into a romantic ideal. Renaissance painters, working from pure imagination rather than any real reference, painted her according to whatever European beauty standards were fashionable in their own era. By the 19th century, an entire artistic movement built exotic, romanticized images of Cleopatra as the ultimate seductive queen of the East. And then, in the 20th century, Hollywood permanently cemented the image for modern audiences, casting stars like Elizabeth Taylor and dressing them in elaborate costumes that had far more to do with mid-century Western glamour than with anything resembling actual Ptolemaic Egypt. Here's the detail that really deserves attention, though. Nearly every serious historian, ancient and modern alike, agrees on something that gets lost underneath all this talk of beauty. Cleopatra's real power came from her intelligence and political skill, not her appearance. She ruled Egypt for roughly 2 decades during one of the most dangerous, unstable periods in the ancient Mediterranean world, somehow managing to preserve her country's independence while Rome was actively swallowing up kingdom after kingdom around her. She formed calculated political alliances with 2 of the most powerful men in the entire Roman world, first Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, not through any simple seduction, but through genuine strategic partnership, shared political interests, and, by most accounts, real personal connection built through her wit and conversation rather than her looks alone. She also understood something many rulers of her era completely missed: the deliberate power of image and public performance. She associated herself directly with the Egyptian goddess Isis, presenting herself not just as a political ruler, but as something closer to a living deity in the eyes of her subjects. She staged elaborate, unforgettable public appearances, understood the value of ceremony and spectacle, and controlled how she was seen and remembered with remarkable precision. In many ways, the entire myth of her extraordinary beauty is itself a kind of accidental tribute to just how successfully she managed her own public image. She was simply so effective at projecting power and charisma that later generations assumed physical beauty must have been the explanation. So if we set aside the Hollywood version entirely, what we're left with is arguably a far more impressive woman than the legend ever gave her credit for. A ruler fluent in numerous languages in an era when most rulers relied entirely on translators. A queen who genuinely tried to understand and connect with the Egyptian culture she governed, rather than remaining distant from it the way her entire family had for generations before her. A strategist who kept her kingdom independent for 22 years through sheer political skill, while everything around her was being absorbed into an expanding Roman Empire. It's worth asking, gently, why history seems to have needed her to be beautiful in the first place. Perhaps it was simply easier, across so many centuries, to explain a powerful woman's success through her looks rather than her mind. It's a pattern that shows up again and again throughout history. Whenever a woman rises to genuine power, her intelligence gets quietly erased, replaced by a much simpler, much more familiar story about beauty and seduction instead. Cleopatra herself, it seems, would likely have understood this dynamic perfectly. She spent her entire reign carefully managing exactly how the world perceived her. Perhaps, in some strange way, the enduring myth of her beauty is simply the final, unintended success of that same lifelong effort, a legend she helped shape, even if it eventually grew into something far larger and far less accurate than she ever could have controlled. If tonight's story gently shifted the way you picture her, even just a little, that's exactly where we hope to leave you, somewhere quiet, somewhere thoughtful, somewhere far from Hollywood and much closer to the truth. Let this thought settle now. There's nothing more to hold on to tonight. Just let it drift, slowly, into sleep.